very appreciative to be invited here today to talk to you about a couple of topics. Today, ravens, tomorrow, wildfire, and some of the lessons we've learned in the greater sage-grouse range. I'm part of a bi-state working group there, and a lot of similarities between Gunnison sage-grouse and what's happening in the bi-state, and I'll be referring back to that population throughout a couple of these talks. So raven populations, as most of you know, are increasing across the West, and this is a very contentious issue, one that sparks emotion, and it's a native animal on our landscape, and for good reason. It's been really integrated with human society, civilizations for thousands of years. It dates back to Roman Greek mythology, where a raven was actually a pet of god Apollo and was thought to be scorched black because of unpleasant secrets the ravens would tell him. And it's also worked its way through lots of indigenous cultures as well. It's been around for many, many years and really integrated in our society. We're all very accustomed to some of the literature of ravens. Edgar Allan Poe, for example, expressing grievance for the lost one. Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds, if you remember that, really demonstrating how ravens can be evil or blackbirds in general. But it's usually associated with death, uncleanliness, evil, or those types of concepts. But what does the science tell us about ravens? Well, this is one of the most widespread passerine birds on the planet, from the tropics to the Arctic. It's omnivorous, meaning that it has a wide variety of diet items that it uses. It could prey switch very quickly, and it's very smart for those reasons, but it's a generalist, and we think of it as a mesopredator at that. It's synanthropic, meaning that it enjoys what we offer, anthropogenic subsidies on the landscape, and it increases reproduction survival. I'm going to talk quite a bit about that. Appears to mate for life, a very social animal, has a lot of hierarchy, especially in the transient, non-resident type of ravens, and very confident. This bird stands up to all of the birds that are well equipped with talons and beaks and so forth, and does pretty well at taking over their nest and doing things like that, outsmarting them because of their level of intelligence. Corvidaes in general are among the most intelligent birds on the planet, and carrion crows have been shown to actually use tools, and ravens themselves have also showed some really impressive cognitive abilities. So I'm going to talk to you about basically this diagram here: the expansion of ravens, distribution and abundance, anthropogenic resource subsidies, what this means for sensitive species, and then where we go from here. Just going to show you some data summary. I love to just start out with data summary, just because without all the modeling and everything, it really tells a bit of a story. These are breeding bird survey routes back in the 1970s, beginning of about 50 years ago or so. And you can see there's not a whole lot of routes up there, but there's a lot of black dots, meaning no ravens were found at those sites during this time. Some of them got up over 100. You can see the legend here. The larger the circle and the different color reflects how many birds were found at those routes. When we skip ahead 40 years or so, we see double the detections. We have a lot more routes out there, but the detection of ravens doubled to 80%. But more importantly, within those routes, we see a lot more ravens. We're getting up in the numbers of 300-400 birds per survey. Their range is expanding as well as increasing within their range. And we've carried out a study in collaboration with Heron Ecological, Seth Haryu, on what these expansions look like using a Bayesian type of model with the breeding bird survey data that accounts for imperfect detection and so forth. And continental-wide, you can see these lines look very different than what we see with sage-grouse populations. They're increasing over time, and some of them have some exponential shape to them, specifically in the cold and warm desert systems. And you can see that reflected in the red on the ecoregions there on the right figure. We're seeing increases around 400% in these areas. So what's driving this? We have this potential problem of an increasing species, but what's causing it? And it has a lot to do with anthropogenic resource subsidies. We're providing food for ravens when it's unavailable, or even when it is available for transient ravens that are subadults. It takes about 3 to 5 years before they'll breed. And these large food sources are kind of food bonanzas. And there's also point sources spread, diffused throughout the landscape, truck stops and so forth, that ravens can get a free meal. But not only are we providing food, we're providing perch and nesting substrate out there, especially in these remote environments. So you could think of this as room and board. Ravens are able to take advantage of a power line like this or a tall structure. And imagine now the predation rate of any other species going after this raven's nest as opposed to on a cliff face or in a tree. It's very low. So they're very successful at it. They've figured that out. They're very intelligent animals, and they focus on these types of factors. So we're working on a conceptual model here. Bill Borman originally came up with this in the tortoise world and trying to parameterize this model, understand the data that drive it. We basically have this life history cycle, non-breeding transient ravens that move about the environment called floaters, which can establish pair bonds after a few years, become mating individuals, and then you have individuals looking to establish territories, which are nesting individuals, leading back to fledglings, which then join these very large groups of ravens. So how are humans influencing this? Well, as far as the non-breeding ravens, us and many others have looked at what types of factors are leading to high densities of ravens. So this particular study, which involves 50 sites, over 15,000 point surveys, where we're modeling raven densities across the Great Basin, we're trying to understand which factors are leading to the highest density of ravens, which gets at these non-breeding ravens. And it turns out that there's about 0.54 ravens per square kilometer across the entire Great Basin. And remember that number. I'm going to come back to that a little bit later, but a little over 1 raven per 2 square kilometer. Total abundance in the Great Basin is about 403,000 ravens and 165,000 within sagebrush ecosystems. But you can see some really interesting patterns here if you know the Great Basin well. They follow these interstate corridors, largely associated with metropolitan areas and so forth. But some of the effects we came up with was agricultural fields, developed areas, large transmission lines, even distribution lines, and typically at lower elevations. And there's interactions there, meaning that the influence of agriculture fields is really largely dependent on other types of anthropogenic resources, multiplicative effects, where we can see in these figures here, when you're closer distance to any of these, you have cumulative effects or multiplicative effects that lead to higher densities of ravens. That allows us to take those parameter estimates and map that back on the landscape. I'm going to come back to these maps when I talk about solutions for moving forward management options. There's another key component here, and that's occurrence of ravens, occupancy. And occupancy is a little bit different. It's basically the probability the raven's going to occur in the environment, not necessarily what's leading to its density. But we see some very similar factors and some different ones: transmission lines, rest areas, multiplicative effect between those, road density, landfill, and so forth that really drive these occupancy patterns. Now we can also take the parameter estimates from those that are anthropogenically influenced versus natural effects and isolate those, subtract those surfaces, and get to where, for example, in that lower right-hand figure, where humans and the anthropogenic influences are actually influencing raven occupancy in those sites. And we've developed some mapping products for that. And the Mojave Desert, they're seeing similar things. This is non-breeding ravens here. Selection coefficients for those, and anything above 0 is selected, below 0 is not. And you can see conspecifics, that's just other ravens or driving ravens being in those areas. But feeding operations, crops, pastureland, urban, roads, and so forth, all of these were factors when other types of variables were put into this model that really influenced non-breeding ravens. It's actually exurban environments and desert environments of which they avoided. This is where resident ravens really tend to occupy in these remote locations. I'm going to talk a bit about that here in a moment. We've also found through a lot of this survey work, we're doing livestock and raptor surveys out there as well, but some of the livestock results indicate that the odds of raven occurrence increased nearly 50% in areas where livestock are present. And this really has a lot to do with the food offerings of livestock, afterbirths, those types of things, as well as calving operations, but also the water features that livestock are using. Ravens are needing those water features on the landscape too. So that helps move these birds around the environment. Getting back to this conceptual model, that's an influence on non-breeding ravens, but there's also influences happening on these nesting breeding ravens in the landscape. For example, when you go back to the 1990s, Knight and Kawashima showed that they disproportionately used transmission lines more than these other natural features like cliff faces and trees and so forth. And then some of the work we did in INL demonstrate there on the right-hand curve that distance to transmission line was a really influential factor on nesting, increasing the probability of selecting that nest. And what's interesting is when you compare this to other species, ravens are kind of unique at this, that they use these features. Matter of fact, when we look at 3 other large predatory birds, these hawks, Ferruginous, red-tailed, and Swainson's, they don't quite show that same behavior. The anthropogenic probability of use is on the right side there. The black bar represents ravens, and you can see it's a lot more consistent when we're thinking about natural substrates. As a matter of fact, ravens will occupy nests that are built by some of these types of hawks in following years, and sometimes even remove them from their own nests. So this is something typical across the landscapes. Here's a sagebrush ecosystem devoid of trees, devoid of cliff faces. Ravens would need a lot of energy to hunt this area. They'd need to move around and fly about this, and they're not going to be very efficient at accessing prey in this environment. However, if you run a transmission line through it, you've just created a lot of access, not just for perching ravens, these non-breeding ravens, but also for these resident birds, which can learn that environment very well. They're very intelligent, know exactly where to go every year to find these nests. Coupled with that, I'm going to talk about this tomorrow, is the lack of cover. You can see the transmission line associated with a cheatgrass or invasive grass type of environment here, which opens up the canopy cover, making them much more vulnerable to predation from such a visually cute predator. Distance to anthropogenic structure is important as well. This food source is really shown to actually improve juvenile survivalship and fledgling rates. You can see here, this is a landfill in this case, but about twice as much juvenile survival than when we get out to about 3 or 4 kilometers from that landfill. So that food source really helps feed those young and really reduces sibling competition when you can bring back enough food. So all of this, we're learning about it, and we're understanding that our influences on these environments are causing a change in this native predator. But what does this mean for prey? Well, there's a couple of terms that are floated around in the literature. Hyperpredation, which means that there's this background predation rate, but it could be increased in these remote environments because of the influence of another type of food source. It's typically referred to when it comes to an invasive animal or an exotic animal that increases the predator, and then that predator exudes pressure on a native prey. But in this case, it's these anthropogenic resources. There's also spillover predation, where you have something like a landfill and a lot of transient ravens associated with that spill over into pristine habitat as they're looking for food in certain times of the environment and cause predation impacts. Nevertheless, both of these have substantial impacts on sensitive prey species. This paper is part of that human-wildlife interaction special issue that's coming out, where we've quantified the effects across numerous species. We've searched the literature of all different species out here. Here's a list of the species that we found are potentially impacted in one way or another at different vital rates that might be influencing population growth. And that map actually shows the overlap in distribution among those sensitive species in ravens. You can see it's quite extensive as ravens have such a large distribution. Now let's look a little bit closer. When we look into each of these individual species and look at the raven distribution, which is the raven growth rates, which is the red line that you see there with the credible limits, and what raven growth rates look like outside of the distribution of that sensitive species, something pretty telling emerges here. Raven populations are growing more rapidly within these sensitive species areas than outside. The sensitive species are obviously sensitive because of probably so many influences, anthropogenic type of influences, type conversion of habitat and so forth. But these are the same things that ravens are actually capitalizing on and benefiting from in those environments, causing their populations to go up. Now I want to point out here look at the axes and the differences in those axes. The one that has the largest axis is actually the Gunnison sage-grouse, where we see the largest amount of ravens within a specific sensitive species than any other sensitive species that's being impacted by ravens now. This ranked out as very, very high in our impact index, which includes a lot of other metrics you can read about in the paper there. So let's talk about impacts to sage-grouse populations. As Pat pointed out, I did a lot of work with video years ago and then continued on with that video work to understand from multiple sites what the composition of predators are on sage-grouse. And it turns out that in some areas it's 90% ravens, in other areas it's less than 50. But overall, across all the sites that we've done video work out, we're seeing about over 50% of the predation is caused by ravens, and there's a lot of predators out there. The rest is the other suite of predators there. This interaction over here shows that they're most susceptible during early incubation stage to predation by ravens. This is largely because birds, when they start incubating, they're doing a lot more recessing. They're moving on and off their nests. They're moving around their nest a lot, and they're putting out these visual cues for ravens. As they get kind of locked into better behaviors through time, they're less likely to be depredated. And there's a lot more research out there. I didn't have time to go into that, but on timing of depredation and those types of things that correlate really well with sunset and sunrise patterns. But probably one of the more important findings of this research of depredation on sage-grouse nests is the influence of shrub cover. And this is like doing something about ravens, or really understanding ravens is like really focusing on one piece of the puzzle. There's a lot of pieces here. In order to get the full picture and manage properly, we need to focus on all of them. And shrub cover is a very important one because once we lose shrub cover, the per capita take for ravens actually increases. It's called the functional predator-prey response, but that actually goes up. So the raven becomes more efficient at finding the prey. We all obviously have a problem with raven numbers increasing, but when those ravens are also becoming more efficient because of lack of shrub cover, that's important. A 1% decrease in shrub cover increased the odds of raven predation by 7.15%. And we know that we're losing shrub cover fast. And whether it's the inner space that's perennial grasses are being replaced by cheatgrass, or fires that are moving through and killing sagebrush and cheatgrass reinvading, or just having that low shrub cover for quite some time after a wildfire before it's fully restored, really leverages the raven's ability to find those prey. So we have this really difficult and problematic interaction between the loss of habitat due to cheatgrass invasion and wildfires, and an increase in a subsidized predator on the landscape, which relies on these visual cues. So we've done some studies across all different environments to try to understand what kind of ecological threshold might there be where we could get a handle on this. As we know, an increase in one raven per square kilometer reduces nest survival by 57.2%. And this is based on a study of about 15 different study sites. Some of them have been influenced by fire, others have not. That's where you see the variation in this effect right here, is largely those types of interactions that can influence it. But overall, there is a negative influence here. As you increase raven numbers, you reduce nest survival. And it turns out, if we're using the mean value here of nest survival, about 0.4 ravens per square kilometer, above that, we start to have an impact on nest survival. A substantial impact, one that actually propagates up to an impact on population growth rate. And I'll show that in just a moment. So where is this occurring? Well, we're to a point where we're mapping densities, and we now have an ecological threshold of understanding at what level are raven populations at. So we could take the concentration areas, which are nesting areas for sage-grouse, where ravens are likely to occur, and look at their density within those areas. That's the red that you see on the right-hand figure there. Now, one of the alarming issues here is it's about 63.9% of those concentration areas are above that threshold. And remember, on average, I told you that the average number of ravens across the Great Basin is 0.54, which is well above that threshold. So we have a broad-scale problem with ravens impacting sage-grouse nests. That 63.9% is far more than wildfires have actually influenced sage-grouse habitat, albeit wildfires have much more profound effects across various life stages of sage-grouse, and ravens are only impacting the nesting stage. But from a broad scale perspective, you can imagine it like a blanket that has a lot of pressure at various areas laying down across the entire sage-grouse range, unlike wildfire, which tends to be a little bit more point source effects. So we've modeled population growth rate in relation to ravens to let's see if we get a similar type of threshold. And it turns out that it's a higher threshold, about 0.7, which makes sense because a lot of these populations can compensate through chick survival and adult survival. In other words, higher survival probability there that doesn't relate to negative growth rate. But nevertheless, when we get up to about 10 or 15% nest survival rates, which is fairly typical in a lot of the Great Basin where you have high raven populations, chick survival and adult survival cannot compensate, and you end up with negative growth. And this can happen in intact sagebrush environments just because of the number of predators out there. Obviously, when you lose that sagebrush cover, then it has a much more faster impact. It's not just nesting phase where we're seeing some actual impacts on sage-grouse. Ravens are disrupting the mating process as well. As they're very curious animals, very intelligent animals. This is actually a Gunnison sage-grouse here. Most of you have seen this photo, but we have some photograph and video of them attacking grouse on greater sage-grouse. You can see the tail pulling there. And they do a lot of lek flushing. And we think that a lot of this has to do with following females back or looking to where females go that are visiting the leks. Females will visit leks multiple times and potentially copulate multiple times. And the whole purpose of this is to ensure fertilization of the entire clutch, as it takes them about 8 to 10 days to lay their eggs. So they may be revisiting their nest and dropping an egg every day, but also visiting that lek to copulate. And this is where ravens are their most efficient. They could watch females across a landscape and get back to that nest. As we notice they do on the video camera, when females leave the nest or when they're coming to the nest is when we see most of the predation happening. Okay, so all of this said, what can we do? What's the solution here? We have lots of tools. We have lots of science to direct us. It's putting it together into a framework and trying to implement that framework. So we've developed, I'm part of this National Raven Core team, which is an interagency core team, and it's led by the Fish and Wildlife Service, but has members from a lot of different agencies and producers and so forth involved to come up with a strategy. And this is a basis for that strategy. And the first step, it's basically these 5 steps. I'm going to run through them here as I go through the presentation. So rather than on that slide, the first step is really, where do we start? Where do we go? We have these mapping products, and a lot of the methodology we carried out to obtain the mapping products for the Great Basin can be carried out for the Gunnison region as well. And we have some protocols developed on how to do the point count surveys and the mapping procedures. And that's going to be coming out in this human-wildlife interactions issues as well. But we could use these mapping products to at least decipher where to start, where to go, where the problem might be at its worst. We could take the occupancy maps, for example, and relate those to the density maps. That tells us something about where we have high occupancy and high density is where you get both resident and transient ravens. But where you have high occupancy and low density are these, or tend to be these remote environments where you have a lot of resident ravens out there that can be causing a lot of damage. And we've produced that mapping product too. I didn't put it up here, but deciphering those areas where you're resident versus transient type of areas. Once you understand where to go, where you're likely to have the most impact, We need some field verification that raven numbers are high and that there's raven nests within those areas if there's something to do about those nests. So we have a distance sampling protocol, which has been developed and widely used elsewhere. Lots of books out there, Buckland and so forth on this, and this is the gold standard. But this takes hundreds of raven surveys to estimate detection probability and get it right on what the densities are. So we've developed a rapid assessment based on some resampling from some of the sites with this distance sampling protocol on the number of ravens per survey, and an R function that you could just put into a software package just by doing a rapid survey, and we have a protocol for that to get density estimates with credible limits. This is just some of the data to tell you about how many surveys you need for the rapid assessment. I'm going to just kind of skip through that because I think I'm running out of time. Okay. Okay, great. Thank you. Now, once we understand what that density estimate is at that particular site, and let's say we have a few sites that we're monitoring for that year, then the next step is to compare it to an ecological threshold. And we're thinking about this ecological threshold across different sensitive species as it does vary across these species. We've worked one out for desert tortoise that is quite different than it is for sage-grouse. But for sage-grouse, at this point in time, it's about 0.4 ravens per square kilometer. There could be other factors influencing that. We could refine that threshold depending on how much cover is out there and so forth, which is still research yet to be done here. But given a benchmark like this, an objective like this, then we can actually prioritize that site and assign management actions to that site. For example, those that are clearly above that ecological threshold that you see there in the red, and the credible limits, meaning that we've conducted enough surveys or we've got enough consistency in the number of ravens per survey that we're well above that threshold, they may fall into a different tier than these other types of sites. And so we've developed this tiered process. And we're calling that most important one tier 3, where it might have different management actions assigned to it than these other sites, which are in tier 1 and tier 2. Tier 1 means essentially that your confidence limits are overlapping with that threshold, but the majority of the posterior distribution, if you're using Bayesian analysis, or your point estimate is below that threshold, and then tier 2 is that estimate is above the threshold, but there's still uncertainty in it. Now, how do these tiers interact? Well, now that we understand the biology of ravens, we can actually prescribe some management actions for each of these tiers. For example, if you're far below the threshold and you're confident in that, no action necessary. You could graduate that site out, move on to another site, and assess it in a similar manner. And tier 1, however, this is for sage-grouse, moves you into a habitat improvement stage, which we know a lot of agencies, a lot of other application already has a lot of this in place. But it's really the importance of this, as I showed how important shrub cover is, and it's not just shrub cover, but just having that intact sagebrush environment. Tier 2, however, we move into something like that. We now have a whole suite of anthropogenic subsidy reduction or denial type of projects that can be implemented. Now, behind this table is a lot of information, a lot of action that I don't have time to get into today. But there's everything from picking up roadkill to covering up water features, fence lines, burying or perch deterrents on transmission lines, all this type of stuff. And this can be deciphered site by site with some of the software products that we're coming up with. Tier 3 is direct actions. And this doesn't necessarily just mean killing ravens and removing them from the site through something like a corvicide or shooting, but also egg oiling techniques and nest removal techniques. There's some research being done on those that have been pretty effective. For example, this egg oiling study that we've conducted in Nevada, we're seeing some pretty interesting and compelling results here. We have multiple sites, and we're using a before-after control impact design over a few years, and it turns out that the average increase in sage-grouse nest survival probability was 141% higher in the treatment group relative to the control groups. That right figure there, the Bakke, is kind of the gold standard. That's where you're measuring survival probabilities before the treatment, after the treatment, and then you're also measuring it at a control site, and you're comparing the ratios of those in this posterior distribution. All that distribution you see on the right figure is the evidence that the effect exists, and you can see it that much greater than 95% of the distribution lies to the right of that line, meaning there's such an improvement. And these were the ratios on the left side, pre-treatment and post-treatment on before and after. So we basically improved spots where ravens were causing a major issue on nest survival and underperforming compared to the controls are now overperforming or performing better than the controls. The fifth step is post-management monitoring. So the idea here is to go back out, do the rapid assessment after the management action, and revise that assessment if it moves into a different tier or it gets graduated out. And so that's the last point there in this 5-step process. And there's again quite a bit of documentation behind that. Obviously, there's a lot here that I've talked about, and there's a lot to try to take home and implement. So we've developed, lastly, this decision support software that does it all for you. This is for the Great Basin, though, and it would be really nice to get a lot of the mapping products for the Gunnison incorporated into this so that this software can be applied to the Gunnison. This is just kind of what the interface of the software looks like, but it basically has different types of leaflet maps, base layers, those types of things, so you could draw where your sites are and walk through all of those steps. And it will also provide information as to what the type of management action for that specific site, given all of the underlying anthropogenic subsidies that are pulled from the GIS. So it allows you to customize your management program. And then it also has the R function in there for the rapid assessment as well. Lots of that's wrapped up in the software, which we'll be releasing in about 2 months here. So lessons learned here, and I'm getting a stop here, so I'm going to move quickly. Raven distribution abundance is growing. Anthropogenic resource subsidies are a primary factor. There's an increase in hyperpredation, specifically from resident birds. They learn in the environment. We're finding 20, 30 eggs cached associated with some of these nests. But spillover predation is also important as the density estimates are coming out. So even those transient birds are finding nests, more eyes in the environment. Multiple species are being impacted. Sage-Grouse is at the top of the list, both greater and Gunnison. And we do need a science-driven management approach, objective-based. And I think the software really makes it helpful to move on this in this regard. And with that, I'll go ahead and I don't know if I have time for questions or not, but thank you for your attention. I appreciate it.
We do have time for about 3 minutes of questions.
Great.
Anybody have questions for Pete?
This is a clarification question. When you're talking about sagebrush cover, are you talking about stand characteristics or % of sagebrush on the landscape?
Well, this is the research that I talked about is at the site level, and it's the actual percentage of sagebrush within the area surrounding the nest. For that specific, those values that I reported on there. So it's something equivalent to using a line intercept or line point intercept method at about a 30-meter radius around the nest. Yep. Good question. I kind of moved through that pretty quickly. So egg oiling is a management technique where the raven eggs are actually oiled. And there's some proprietary type of oil substances out there, although vegetable oil will work, which basically prevents, the pore structure of the egg, prevents oxygen, carbon dioxide exchange, and fails the egg. And so what we see is ravens will continue to incubate that nest, sometimes quite some time after it would have hatched, and maintain the territorial structure within that area, keeping other ravens out. Whereas if that raven is removed, sometimes we see other ravens that are more tolerant of each other, even breeding pairs come in and reoccupy that site in following years. So it's a way to maintain that territorial structure, but not allow for reproduction from that pair. And you could do it through either hand oiling, poles, and drones. And we used all three of those methods at those sites.
You mentioned water features attract ravens. And so kind of our wet meadow restoration project, we're we're trying to restore brooding habitat, and we're creating these things called plug-in spreads, which collect water and spread it out temporarily. So I'm just trying to figure out now if we're going to have to kind of create some kind of mitigation out of, to kind of prevent ravens from getting attracted to these areas.
Yeah, that's a good line of thought. Obviously, in these desert environments, water is the limiting factor for a lot of species, and really the difference between them, their local distributions and increase in survivorship and so forth. And yeah, so if we're creating those water features out there, then it benefiting sage-grouse, but also benefiting ravens. So thinking of unique ways to prevent ravens from using them is a good line of thought. There are some laser techniques, even remote laser techniques that are out there. I mean, obviously this stuff difficult logistically sometimes and expensive, but those have been shown to be pretty influential for at least keeping ravens off pivots and off transmission lines, those types of things. But having maybe some denial of access to the water feature where sage-grouse can access it, but not ravens, might be something to think about.
You have another question at the distance? Okay. Besides the egg oiling option for direct actions, are there any other measures that can be adopted?
Well, there's a lot of actions. Subsidy, one of the tiers is actually focusing on subsidies. That's probably the most important action because that's the one that's actually responsible for raven numbers in the first place, and having any types of actions there kind of kicks the legs out of the problem. Although that takes a lot of time, and with raven populations increasing the way they are, these more direct actions might be necessary, and it's up to the land managers and the public to decide those. But obviously there's more direct actions, nest removal, and timing that nest removal can be an important one, not taking it after the nest, because the ravens will rebuild it very quickly, but taking it while there's, to prevent reproduction and removal of ravens directly. That's been shown to not just reduce raven numbers to below that threshold at sites, but also increase nest survival at those sites. But again, this is a temporary short-term action. And when you remove the raven removal application, ravens will move back into that area. So having restoration projects for the habitat as well as anthropogenic subsidy removal projects while those direct actions that are going on congruent with those is probably the most important. And I forgot to mention that, but in this plan, those tiers are incongruent. So if you're engaged in tier 2, you're carrying out tier 1, and tier 3, you're carrying out tier 2 and tier 1 applications. So you're solving both the long-term and short-term problem.